The murder of Sydney businessman Michael McGurk seems to be morphing into yet another political crisis for the New South Wales Labor Government. It's just 4 days since Mr McGurk's execution-style murder in the front yard of his Sydney home. Nobody's been charged yet, and homicide detectives are ploughing through a long list of suspects. The murder investigation may end up with a political inquiry running alongside it. Just weeks before Mr McGurk's murder, he told journalists he had secret tapes recording allegations of bribery and corruption involving state and federal Labor Party figures. The New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption has stepped in amidst rising political pressure, as Deborah Cornwall reports.
I can understand that there were people who were afraid of him, who were intimidated by him. He could have a menacing side, but he could also have a loving side.
I spoke to him the week before his death, and during that conversation, he said that he was in fear for his life.
In a city where spivs and standover men are a critical cog in the world of business, Michael McGurk was one of the best. But his murder in front of his North Shore home last week has also flushed out some disturbing insights into the real life of Michael McGurk and the way high-stakes business operates in Sydney's big end of town.
What's emerged in the last few days just makes Sydney live up to its reputation as Sin City, when people like McGurk, a standover man and a lender of last resort, figures in business deals involving soccer figures, former premiers, underworld figures, all these people are thrown together in the melee of Sydney business opportunities.
Kate, how are you?
Oh, hi. Look, this is...
Sydney Morning Herald journalist Kate McClymont had been investigating several business deals involving Michael McGurk in the months before his death. He'd also been in court on a number of charges, ranging from assault to firebombing the home of high-profile finance broker Adam Tilley.
He had two personalities. To his family and friends, he was a doting father, but to those he came up against in business, he was an aggressive, violent man who used threats of physical violence, and he was actually charged with some of them to gain an advantage, either for himself or for those for whom he was working.
In a series of conversations with Ms McClymont, Mr McGurk had told her he was furious about the charges against him. He also claimed to have audio tapes which, if released, could bring down the New South Wales government.
He basically said that on them was a picture of bribery and corruption, not just involving politicians, but bureaucrats and local councillors. And we took down a list of names that he mentioned during that conversation.
Former Labor kingmaker turned business lobbyist Graham Richardson yesterday revealed he'd actually heard the tapes at a meeting with Mr McGurk at a city club 6 months ago.
The critical part, where there were supposed to be allegations of bribery, was completely inaudible. There's nothing on the tape that you can understand, neither content nor names.
Mr Richardson said he'd been there representing his client, Sydney property developer Ron Medich, a former associate of Mr McGurk's who he'd been in dispute with over a multi-million-dollar deal. He said the tapes essentially were a conversation between Mr Medich and Mr McGurk where they'd talked about business deals, but there was no mention of corruption. In the end, he'd concluded Mr McGurk was simply trying to shake down his client.
Well, whether you call it blackmail or trying to gain leverage, I'm not so sure. The legal niceties escaped me. And I told him to not waste my time. McGurk never even alleged that there was a politician named on this tape. That's why I'm so surprised by the allegations of the last few days. He wanted money from Ron Medich, and lots of it, millions of dollars.
Just a week before his murder, all the charges against Mr McGurk were suddenly withdrawn, without explanation. But rather than feeling relieved, Mr McGurk rang Ms McClymont, telling her he feared for his life.
He said that he had learnt that someone was planning to kill him, and he gave me the name of the person he thought was planning his murder.
Mr McGurk certainly had a long list of enemies.
People who have had altercations with Michael Some have come out and said that they're quite relieved in his death. Now, I think that's an unwise comment. However, I can understand that there were people who were afraid of him.
He was also notorious for trying to scam money from former business partners, and even some that weren't. In 2006, he took the Sultan of Brunei to court, claiming he'd reneged on a $10 million deal to buy a 400-year-old miniature of the Quran. The case was thrown out.
The fact that McGurk double-crossed or stood over so many people in his business life is just going to make this investigation so much harder for police.
Revelations that Mr McGurk had also had business dealings with a number of former senior Labor figures comes at a time when public confidence in the Rees government is at an all-time low. There's also growing unease about the perceived cosy relationship between the government and property developers, many of whom have been very generous political donors. And Graham Richardson's denial of bribery allegations has only further antagonised the opposition.
It shouldn't be up to Graham Richardson to give this state government a clean bill of health. That's unacceptable in the judicial system. It's unacceptable when serious allegations like this are aired. That's why we need a full investigation into the corruption allegations involved here.
Opposition leader Barry O'Farrell today stepped up his call for a full inquiry into the corruption allegations, a move immediately rejected by Premier Rees.
If there is a recording and it contains material alleging wrongdoing by any public official or any other person, that is to be referred to the state's Corruption Commission.
Deborah Cornwall.